Hello, ladies. This is the fifth PowerPoint for CC8, which is the market mechanism, market failure, and government um, intervention in markets. So that's what we're going to be looking at this afternoon. Okay, so without further ado, we'll get cracking straight on with this. So we're going to be looking at other forms of government intervention, as you'll see, and this is going to include tradable pollution permits and also regulation and one other area which escapes me just for the moment, but we'll get to it when we start to look at the presentations. Okay, so let's move on from there and then let's start in PowerPoint mode. There we go. So those are the three areas. So we've been looking at a couple of things. We've been looking at minimum prices. We've also been looking at taxation to actually address externalities. And we're now going to look at these three areas, as I mentioned: tradable pollution permits, provision of information, and regulations. Okay, so first things first then. This is quite a novel way of addressing issues of externalities, and this is where you provide marketable pollution permits. So effectively, government chooses a particular pollution a target, if you like, for a particular area, and then issues pollution permits to allow the government to meet its pollution targets, but firms can actually buy and sell those permits as a result. Okay, and it is considered to be quite an innovative way of going about things because you can actually market these permits, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. Okay, so we're looking at page 40 in your booklet, and there is a definition of tradable pollution permits and also an explanation of how they work within the booklet. Okay, so with obviously the PowerPoint is very much supplementary to that to sort of help you understand in a wee bit more detail. Okay, so what are they? Well, we just explain what they are. Essentially, what you do is a firm has options and has certain targets put upon it to talk about and to measure the amount of carbon emissions that they're creating. And effectively, by buying a permit, that allows you to pollute, but only up to a certain level, okay? And then these permits can basically be sold on the market, and it's a form of market. They can either be bought or sold, and fines are set if any firm exceeds their pollution limits without actually buying those permits in the first place. So in one sense, they are allowed to pollute, but they're only allowed to pollute to a certain level, and they are actually paying for that privilege. And obviously, the view would be that the government can use that money to actually address some of the pollution that maybe they've created in the first place. So it's essentially trying to use the price mechanism to internalise some of these external costs that we've been talking about. So the externalities being the external cost. To some degree, we're trying to say, well, if you as an organisation are going to pollute the atmosphere, you are going to have to pay for that. And in order to pay for that, you would buy some of these pollution permits, okay? How do they work then? Well, the government basically decides on an efficient amount of pollution, if there is any such figure, and then will produce or release a number of permits that firms can then buy. And they can be traded amongst firms so that low polluters can actually sell their permits to higher polluters, and they can essentially make a profit from that. So obviously that encourages people to produce lower levels of pollution. If, in essence, the total amount of permits is reduced each year by the government, that should, over time, cut the total pollution. So there can be cuts in pollution. It's accepting that, to some degree, there may be some pollution caused by the use of resources, but in this instance, it's about trying to reduce that level. Okay. And effectively, what it's trying to do is use market-based incentives to help reduce that level of pollution. So using the market mechanism, the pricing mechanism to try and help that process. If we look at how that works, and I'll try and just move myself over. So there is the drawing, or there is the diagram for how the whole thing works, and essentially it's to do with, as you can see, a certain level of pollution, and basically the levels set for both supply of carbon emission permits, and also then reducing the amount of supply is designed to try to reduce, obviously, the level of pollution involved. So permit prices and the quantity of permits will obviously adapt to suit the level of demand, and also by reducing supply, that obviously is then going to also reduce the overall level of pollution. So, looking at how this all works then, and basically the slide actually explains step by step how this whole process works. So, the government in this case sets a fixed supply of permits such as S 2016. So this level here. So the quantity of permits is like so. Okay, and then decides how many permits are going to be released in that particular year for 2016, based on what they will perceive to be the social optimum level of output. Okay, so that essentially would lead to a perfectly inelastic supply of permits. Okay, so at Q 2016. Okay, so that's the amount of permits that would be supplied. Obviously, demand for polluters in 2000 by polluters in 2016 will give rise to a demand curve for those permits, as at D 2016, as we can see, like so, down here. Equilibrium price is then set at P 2016, and that essentially then provides an incentive, a powerful incentive for firms to reduce their level of carbon emissions, because they're now going to have to pay a price to generate those emissions, and that price will go up over time. However, those that actually are better at controlling their pollution, maybe improving their carbon efficiency, can sell any spare permits. If they hadn't had to use them, they can sell those permits in the carbon market and then increase their profits as a result. So there is an incentive, a profit incentive, to actually reduce levels of pollution. Those that don't manage to do that will have to buy additional permits, and that essentially reduces their permits. So effectively, or their profit rather, and that should effectively cause the market to adapt, and also businesses to change their behaviour as a result. Okay, so in each of these instances, that should create an incentive to reduce their level of pollution, and also possibly invest in green tech, which is about trying to reduce the overall carbon footprint of your organisation. Clearly, in that scenario, any organisation that's overseeing that carbon market, or in this case, a pollution market, if you like, in this case, the government, they might want to speed up the reduction of emissions, and they can essentially reduce the supply of permits to S 2020 in this case. Okay, so we're talking about supply of 2020. If we reduce that, that's essentially then going to increase the cost at the new equilibrium level. So clearly there are some sensible economic reasons and rationale behind that process. So that explains the diagram in a bit more detail, and hopefully that follows step by step. You might want to add some annotations to your diagram on page 40, but we'll then take a look at this principle and then this carbon emissions trading, which again is explained in quite a lot of detail on page 41. Okay, so a European Union emissions trading scheme. Okay, and effectively this attempts to unite the countries within the EU in an attempt to try to cut emissions, and to hopefully then reduce the level of climate change caused by those emissions and by the pollution. Okay, so effectively you can see that since 2005 there have been 12,000 energy intensive plants in the UK, and they've been able to buy and sell these permits, which allows them to emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Okay, however, they're not just given carte blanche to do that. It's very much controlled under this process of buying permits, etc. And obviously, anybody that's exceeding their individual limits will have to buy those unused permits and essentially internalise that external cost that the externality is causing. Those that exceed their limit and are unable to buy those spare permits are going to be fined as well. So again, there's an incentive for people to actually reduce the level of pollution involved. Number of organisations that have got involved within it, and obviously a number of industries are affected by it. Power generation, iron, steel, glass and cement all tend to be quite heavily polluting in their traditional form. And in this case, the ETS scheme actually covers about 40% of the EU's total CO2 emissions. So it's making an impact, and hopefully the idea is that more people will invest in better tech, less polluting tech, in order to try and improve that whole process. National governments, in this case, those that have bought into this ETS scheme, can keep up to 10% of the carbon permits and sell them to raise funds. So again, that's a means of actually maybe the government using some of the funds that they generate from that to try to address pollution issues and levels of pollution on a different level too. And clearly, as mentioned before, it does very much incentivise firms to invest in clean tech and reduce their CO2 emissions and carbon emissions in the long term. Clearly, there is a view to think that obviously it would be nice to think that firms that invest in these schemes will also happen in other parts of the world too, so like in India and China. And obviously, if that is the case, then hopefully that will be a situation where the overall position will improve, not just that individual. In this case, unions, the EU. It should be considered an important thing for all countries to do. Okay, so if we look at page 41. There is an article on Tata Steel, okay, talking about the windfall that they received from carbon emission permits. There is also an article on page 41 that you can have a read through, and there are some questions for you to answer on that. Okay, so have a read through that, and it should actually give you some clear indications as to how you can answer these 6 questions to do with the article. So again, having a couple of examples like this, if you were going to talk about carbon emissions, then having in this case reference for that is the reason why we've got that in the booklet, and also you can then consider the responses to these questions as they're listed on page 42 and 43. Now, in addition to those questions, which are obviously in your booklet, I'd also like you to give some thought to advantages and disadvantages for. Let's just come on that for a minute. Advantage and disadvantages for tradable permit schemes. Okay. Now, again, it's something that you can actually have a go at yourself on page 43, and if you want to do that without looking at the responses, the answers, then please by all means do. It's always helpful to do that, and then you can obviously fill in the gaps if that you haven't included. So, main advantage: using the market mechanism, which provides powerful incentives for firms to reduce their carbon emissions. The revenues raised by selling those permits should be able to be used to fund green tech and other environmental schemes. But the disadvantages are the government could possibly suffer from imperfect information about the full social costs of CO2 emissions and the impact that has on the overall environment and climate change and acid rain, etc., etc. And that might mean that when the government tries to set those particular targets and the number of permits, perhaps, then that might lead to government failure in terms of the number that they choose to set. And if the price of permits is too low, well, firms will just carry on and do it, and they're not going to be sufficiently incentivized to cut their CO2 emissions. So it's got to hurt. Firms have got to put some skin in the game in order for that to, for it to be a workable scenario. Okay, typical data response question then. So thinking about this, okay, and obviously this is relevant to a particular extract, but thinking about the way in which you might get asked these sorts of questions with reference to extract one and your own knowledge, assess the benefits of a system of tradable pollution permits for reducing carbon emissions. That would be a typical 15-mark question. And again, thinking about this principle of advantages and disadvantages, benefits and issues around reducing carbon emissions, that would be something to bear in mind. Okay, so typical sort of data response question. Now, in terms of other things that we might look at, then, okay, we've considered some of the issues around some of the ways that the government can address these externalities, but this is another one where there are government policies that are designed to address negative externalities. Okay, and this is essentially regulation and compliance. Okay, so we're going to take a look at, in this case, moving on to page 46 and 47. In this case, again, looking at regulation in particular markets, okay? So clearly, in some cases, regulations can work very well, okay, depending on the type of regulation that their governments are trying to bring in. They're quite easy to put in place. They should be quite quick to be put in place, and they are normally going to have some sort of effect, and they're used by most countries. So regulation clearly is a way to go. However, in some cases, can be quite difficult to administer and quite costly to administer. You've got to pay inspectors to go and make sure people are meeting regulations, and sometimes it's almost unpoliceable, isn't it? So to some degree, we do need to bear that in mind. Firms clearly will have what are known as compliance costs. So effectively, if regulations are set, and if you take the financial services industry as an example, they've got compliance officers all over their organisations, because if you don't meet those regulations, they can be very, very expensive. And in some cases, the need to pay for extra equipment and adding to costs of production and costs of for organisations, which then can affect their overall competitiveness. There could be new equipment required. There could be filters in this case and safer materials to use to reduce these issues. So there are a whole bunch of issues around this. Okay, sometimes you might find that firms or fines won't be set at a high enough level, because in some instances, some of the large organisations and cash-rich companies that are around, they'll just accept that they will pay a fine because it's not really going to have that much of an effect on them. So there you tend to see over time these regulatory issues where people are not actually taking notice of the regulation. They tend to start. There are examples in the media almost on a daily basis of some very, very significant fines, so that it actually does cause organisations that are flouting these regulations to actually toe the line. So, examples of different organisations, different sectors that have different forms of regulation. Okay, so the first one we're going to look at, which is on page 47 in your booklet, is the regulation on electrical and electronic waste. Now, again, significant issues to bear in mind. Okay, so in this instance, as with a lot of these types of issues, the EU is the origin of much of the UK's environmental legislation, and under certain directives, manufacturers and retailers have now got specific responsibilities to make sure they recover and recycle any waste electrical products. Clearly, in some cases, particularly with electrical products, where you're talking about some significantly nasty metals, heavy metals like lead, mercury, cadmium, those were traditionally used, and nobody really considered the implications of how you might the poison that they create in the atmosphere, and the issues of trying to recycle them or trying to remove them from products. So trying to encourage businesses to look at more sustainable and safer alternatives is what this is all about. the issue, the image that you can see here is of the Eden Project. Some of you may have visited the Eden Project down in Cornwall, but that's a sculpture of that represents the amount of waste, of electrical waste, of one individual in a lifetime. So it just gives you an idea of the scale of the issue that we're facing. Again, on page 47, there's a bit more detail included on electronic waste there, which is sort of what we just talked about there. But if we then take a look at the next level, okay, and this is where we're looking at the regulation on use of pesticides. Now, clearly, there is a bit of an issue in terms of pesticides and the way in which they're used, and the fact that they can they cause a significant issue to the growth cycle of various things in the environment, various different forms of products and raw materials that are grown. But in this instance, it's about thinking about how are we affecting the sort of life cycle of various different animals and in this case bees as an example. Okay, so this again, relatively hot off the press at 2017. Looking at Europe, we're looking at a total ban for bee harming pesticides. So again, trying to address some of the issues around the effect that these pesticides might have on the different processes that are required for pollination and growth of their various different crops. So clearly, in some cases, and we know that bee populations have been declining on a fairly regular basis, and there's one particular group of insecticides. I'm not going to try and pronounce it, neonicotinoids, which are basically been used for quite some time, and they have a serious link to a serious harm in bees. And there are umpteen examples of pesticides causing issues around, the use of them causing issues around pollution too. Clearly, quite a lot of discussion around environmental campaigners feeling it's a very important principle, but farmers and intensive farmers who are desperately trying to produce more from their crop yields, etc. But clearly, there's a few issues around that, and that's a constantly evolving debate. But clearly, that's another thing that has been put in place to try to address some of the environmental issues around the use of pesticides. Okay, so more examples and information on page 47 are included there, and give it some thought in terms of the whole pesticide ban. What would be the arguments for? What would be the arguments against that? So something again to try to get your thought process sorted, so that if you've got an example of, in this case, pesticides and the issues that are faced by the environment through pesticides, is there a case for pesticide bans? And if so, what would those arguments be? And what would be the arguments against? So that you've got a balanced view that you can then present should you need to use that in any exam-based question. Okay, next one then, the ban on petrol and diesel cars. Okay, so this is obviously a very current one that we've talked about on a number of occasions. We've been in lessons. Okay, so we're talking about the ban of sale of petrol and diesel cars across the EU at different time frames. But fundamentally, if we take as this example, this is where France are actually talking about the sale of banning the sale of petrol and diesel cars by 2040. And certainly there are a number of organisations that have also said that that they are trying desperately to reduce that number. So Volvo, as an example, will only make fully electric or hybrid cars from 2019 onwards. So clearly that is going to make a significant difference when we're talking about governments coming together with the Paris Climate Accord, as an example, but also businesses changing their whole nature of production to suit these issues. So petrol and diesel cars won't be being manufactured as new cars in the fairly near future. So clearly, it's going to take some time for that to all work through. But the very fact that I couldn't have conceived there being a ban on petrol and diesel cars not even 15, 20 years ago. Although clearly it was going to be a means of trying to reduce our reliance on oil, but also the environmental implications. But that is running at a significant rate at the moment, and obviously, the quicker that can happen, the more chance we've got of actually improving the environment position. More detail looking at Norway as an example, who've got very high penetration of electric cars, the highest penetration of electric cars in the world. And again, they are setting certain targets. And as more organisations and more businesses, more governments are seeing this as a fundamental principle, that clearly is just going to cause the speed of that of that whole movement to develop at an even greater rate. Thinking about this again, trying to think about the arguments for and against regulations. Clearly, there is an argument to say that regulation can work, but there are also issues around how easy it is to police, and also are the fines going to be high enough for people to actually take any note of them. Examples of that you could use. Clearly, we've talked about them being easy to set up, so that's a real positive for. Okay, particularly useful if the social optimum level of output is 0. So maybe to ban a particular thing. Okay, because that's clear. You can clearly see whether that's working or not if it's still happening. Okay, so evidence seems to have shown some success in the past. So, for instance, the ban on CFCs that used to be used as a refrigerant in fridges and a number of other things, accelerators for aerosols, etc. So that clearly is designed and has helped to reduce the depletion of the ozone layer in the environment. Can be very costly to administer, as we mentioned, and in some cases regulations will just be ignored by some, and the fines clearly need to be enforced, and they need to the regulatory bodies need to have the authority and the power to be able to significantly affect a firm's business if they choose to flout those rules. Okay, so other things to bear in mind then, okay, and to consider. So other things that a government might choose to do, and there's quite a nice film for you to take a look at that I'll let you have a look at, which talks about healthy eating. So one of the things we talked about is provision of information to try and address these negative externalities. So in this instance, there is a film with the help of Wallace and Gromit talking about healthy eating. So go and have a view of that and see what you think. See whether you think that that actually has an effect or not. So that really is the next set of slides completed. So that completes up to and includes page 49 of your booklet. The next thing we'll look at in PowerPoint 6 will be subsidies and maximum prices, where we're essentially starting to try to exploit positive externalities, as opposed to try and address and try to stop negative externalities from causing issues. So I'll see you next time.